Orono, which some of you may or may not be aware. We're a bedroom community to the city of Bangor. We do have the flagship University of Maine here in Orono. My population count as far as voting is somewhere between 10,000 and 11,000 registered voters. Elections. My office handles everything from soup to nuts. And what I mean by that is we are doing the recruitment, we're doing the planning, we're meeting with the residents at the very basic level for voter reg drives and getting them registered. But then we're putting on our other hat and we are organizing, we're meeting with building officials and different teams to make sure that we have all of the pieces of the logistics in place so the election can happen. We're getting the PR out, we're updating the website, we're training the election workers, we're working on the ground with the voters, and then of course we're working hand in hand with Shenna's office and the Secretary of State to be sure that we're executing the goal at the end of the day and conducting the state and federal and local elections effectively. Orono has 3 elections a year. So I like to tell people that an election cycle is about 90 days start to finish in a roundabout way. So I'm always in an election. Like there isn't a day of the year that I'm not at work, that I'm in active election planning or organization. And then of course, at the end, we wrap things up, we do the VPH, we report back to our council and to the state, any of the ups or downs and the budgetary concerns, and we're doing it all. Yeah, so that's a day in the life of an Orono town clerk. Now, city clerks and town clerks around the state of Maine all have different roles and they have different pieces they may or may not handle. And then depending on their election cycle, they may only be doing elections with the state in conjunction with them, or they may be having annual town meeting, which is another type of election in a roundabout way. So we do it all here.
Wow. Well, thank you for giving that overview. It was so great. And I have a very quick question because maybe you can answer. What is a VPH?
So VPH is your voter participation history, or your participation in that particular election. So immediately following an election, once all of the same day voter registrations have been updated, new voters have been added, and that period closes, clerks then will sit down and they will go through the incoming list and they will update that list of every single person who either checked in at the incoming table and got a ballot, or those that registered that day and was issued a ballot. And at the end, our goal is to have the number of ballots tabulated by the machine match the incoming list, so that we have a layer of credibility to the results that were produced.
Great. Thank you so much. Secretary Bellows, do you want to tell us a little bit about your office in elections?
Absolutely. And I am so thrilled to be celebrating with the League of Women Voters today, celebrating our election heroes. And it's wonderful to have Shelly with us. She is a true elections hero, such a skilled and professional clerk, one of the leaders in our state. We are really fortunate here in Maine to have such amazing local election officials. So as Secretary of State, you can probably see on the wall behind me, there's a copy of Maine's Constitution. So under the Constitution, the Secretary of State is the chief elections official for the state of Maine. And I have an amazing team, a division of elections run by Deputy Secretary of State Julie Flynn, who oversees state and federal elections. That's something that's very important to realize, is that municipal elections are overseen by the municipalities. Our jurisdiction at the state level is state and federal elections. And we have some really important roles. First, we are interpreting the laws and setting the standards and procedures for the election. So a lot goes into providing materials to the clerks so that they have accurate information about requirements at every step of the process of conducting a federal or state election. And that includes both the primaries and the general elections. We also do a lot of work on proper ballot design and preparation of the ballots prior to an election, and then distribution of ballots and absentee envelopes out to the municipalities for the state and federal elections. We oversee the central voter registration system. So historically, for decades, voter registration lists in Maine were held by the municipalities, and some municipalities, some of the smaller towns, had paper lists, and some of the larger municipalities had their own versions of central voter registration systems for their municipality. But back in 2007, Maine installed a centralized voter registration system, which has all of the voters for the entire state listed in it. And that is where the clerks upload that really crucial voter participation history. So we do a lot of work with the clerks to oversee voter registration and then verification of the voter participation history. We also do certification of the results after the election has occurred. So the municipalities upload their ballot totals, their results, the voter participation history. We scrutinize that very carefully. We ensure that there is no, that there aren't mistakes, or that there aren't occasions where someone has voted twice in the whole state, for example. So we do that work as well. And then we work with the legislature in updating and strengthening our voter registration laws. So those are some of the things that we do at the Secretary of State's office. And we can talk a little bit more about what we do in more detail as we go through the panel. But it's very exciting to get to be involved in this work in protecting democracy. And the reason I'm so excited about this panel is there's a role for everyone to play, as election workers, as volunteers. Our democracy is about citizen engagement.
Yeah, I'm sure we will have plenty more to say on that today. So thank you so much. Keara, would you like to tell us a little bit about your work?
I'd be happy to. And thank you so much for having me today. It's both a pleasure and an honor to be a part of this panel. And I have learned so much from Secretary Bellows about election administration. The local clerks in Maine are really doing just superhero level work to make elections work in an increasingly challenging environment for voters, especially as we, had to adapt to the pandemic. And I just appreciate all that all of you do every single day. So my name is Keara Fenzel. I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Center for Tech and Civic Life, CTCL. And I am an election administration hype woman. Our organization is dedicated to serving local elections officials, both through providing direct technical support and trainings through our government services department, by providing data and information about elections and challenging disinformation in our civic info department. And then in our advocacy department, we have been working to provide resources to local offices. So in 2020, CTCL saw that there was a big problem in the need for local elections offices to adapt to the pandemic, purchasing PPE and plexiglass, finding new offices so that folks could socially distance, trying mail ballots or a huge influx of absentee ballots for the first time. And often we see in election administration that administrators are asked to do more with, more faster, new things without a real understanding of the financial limitations of implementing that, including the time and staff limitations as well. So in 2020, we took an unprecedented step in providing direct grants to local offices to be a Band-Aid in that really challenging environment. But we know that the private sector can't be the sustaining factor for local offices, and also found that the need was far greater than what we were able to do in one grant cycle. So we've pivoted our strategy to advocate for federal funding in elections. Right now, we're working on the Election Infrastructure Initiative, which is a project to secure $20 billion in federal funding, with 2/3 of that going to locals and 1/3 going to the states. And that's over the next 10 years. And I can share a little bit more about how that's looking, but also, our number one priority is to make sure that elections funding is sufficient and allows space for infrastructure of all types, staff, locations, technology, and also that it's predictable so that folks can make plans to scale up their offices if that's appropriate for their communities, or just know what's coming in the future so that that funding isn't coming in at the last minute and nobody knows, how we're supposed to spend it, or being in situations where we're in budget shortfalls and having to make tough decisions. So that's my role. I'm definitely a behind the scenes actor and want to make sure that locals have both the autonomy and ability to get what they need.
That's great. That is really exciting work, and I know that we'll definitely be talking more about that in today's panel. All right, so the next thing I wanted to ask, and this is some of this I think all of you have covered to some degree already, but I kind of want to just frame it as its own question. What is it like to run an election in the year 2022? What is the environment for running elections right now, generally speaking? And there's a few, we can go into various details on this, but in sort of just zooming in on this year, what's it like running an election right now? And I'll open this up just if anyone has any thoughts on current things you're seeing, trends or issues or anything.
So I think Shelly is probably the best equipped to answer what it feels like to be in the thick of it. But I just want to speak from a statewide perspective, some of the observations that we're making. So we're in a time of concerning disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. There are a lot of conspiracy theories about the election of 2020, and quite frankly, what's called the big lie about the election results. And I think, unfortunately, how that translates on the ground here in our state is distrust in the integrity of our elections. And so what we really want people to understand is that we have a very open and transparent elections process. Under Maine law, poll workers are required to be recruited from both parties. So there are Republican and Democratic volunteer poll workers, and as well as independents and Green Party members, welcome too. But the two major political parties have to be equally represented among the poll workers at the polls. And so we are recruiting volunteers to participate in that process. We think it's a really wonderful window into how safe, secure, and accessible our elections are and how fair they are. We should be really proud of the integrity of our elections here in Maine, and we should be proud of our voter participation. In 2020, we were third in the nation in voter participation, and that's phenomenal. And so we want to do everything that we can to encourage people to get involved in elections, to exercise their right to vote. And we want to also demystify the process. So I think part of the reason that sometimes there's the room for conspiracy theories to grow is a lack of understanding of the careful checks and balances that Shelly already described. And some of it's just common sense, but you just don't really reflect on it. The fact that when you go to the polls, you state your name and your residence, and there are the two poll workers, and you might not know that one is a Republican and one is a Democrat, but there they are, and they're checking your name off and handing you that ballot. And you go into the polling booth, and then you deposit in a tabulator in a larger municipality or a ballot box in a smaller municipality. And at the end of the night, just like Shelly described, those tallies, that number of ballots that are counted is matched against the number of names on those lists. And that is the number one sort of, it's such a clear check and balance because there are eyes on every one of those steps. And you have to make sure that the people that announce themselves who are registered voters, you know, are those totals do in fact match the ballot. So there are all these safeguards in the process, but I think we have an obligation in 2022 to share that information, to try to demystify this and to get people involved, because I think that's how we protect our democracy. The only other thing that I would say is that there's some fear out there. Reuters documented in 2021 over 850 threats against election workers, and we were not immune here in Maine. There were 2 documented threats of violence against election workers that were very serious. So I'm really happy. Thank you to the League of Women Voters. We were able to pass legislation to protect our election workers, but that's just another layer. And it's also another consequence of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, because when people don't trust the integrity, they blame the people most responsible for carrying out those elections. And that's when you get into these really scary situations. So there are lots of reasons, strengthening trust in democracy and protecting our election workers, that we need to get informed, get educated, and educate others about how our elections work.
Thank you. Shelly, would you like to say a little bit?
Sure. So Shenna did a great job of giving the broad overview from a state's perspective. As a clerk, I think what I could do is explain when I first got into the business as to now, and that might give you an idea of how things have changed. So when I first got into this business and was organizing and running my first election, it was kind of like family reunion. Everyone would come into the gym, people were bringing pies and cookies, and they were hugging the election workers. And it was a day for the whole municipality to turn out and to all work together to implement change. And people were positive and they trusted the process. There weren't a lot of questions. You went about your day and you pulled off the election and you put up your results, and you might get a call or 2 about, so did you get your sleep yet? Are you rested? That kind of a concern from your residents. Flash forward 2020, we started to see the beginning seeds of doubt, the conspiracy theories, as Shenna had mentioned. We started seeing the media trying to do education on voter processes that they may or may not have had firsthand experience with. And so they were doing the best they could with the material that they had, but didn't necessarily know the how, the why, or the where of the steps that election workers were taking. Everyone being best intended to educate may have created some of the confusion. And then, of course, we had the election. And then we were all blasted in our homes with, this is how Georgia's done it, this is how New York's done it, or Colorado's done it. And then you've got Maine, who's completely opposite of how everyone else tabulated their results and did their absentee ballots. And that only fostered more confusion. So on the ground, what that has meant for us in Maine, the clerks, is that we've had to be very proactive. We have not been able to just follow a timeline and a set of, you do this in, 2 months ahead, and you do this the 3 weeks ahead. We have to be proactive. We have to think about plan A, plan B, plan C. We have to think about getting, actual how-tos or material placed on our website to further explain how we might process an absentee ballot, how we might register a voter, because we want the information coming out of our office to be the information that our public reads and trusts. On that election day, we are not maybe approaching that voter and giving hugs anymore. We're not receiving the cookies and the pies. And that's not what it's about. That's not what I'm saying. But COVID put a layer on top of our elections process where what was normal and what was taught and experienced was all new again. And we had to completely reinvent what conducting an election looked like when we couldn't have that human connection or that human touch. And I say that like I'm being kind of strange about the whole thing, but there are residents in our community that do not engage except for on election day. That's the only day they get out and they meet friends, family, and neighbors. So we had to do things differently. Shenna did talk about some of the threats and some of the anger and the frustration that we deal with. And we were seeing that in August. The election wasn't even until November in 2020, and we were getting anger and frustration in August, which meant we had to completely rethink how we handle situations at our counters, how we responded to emails and phone calls in regards to absentee ballots or people who thought that they weren't going to get their ballots in time. So I am not saying that elections is not still something that I love to do. It's different. I still enjoy elections, but how I approach elections is much more strategic. It's more thought out. And I'm having to have conversations much earlier with my law officials and my media contacts and my building administrators. I'm having conversations that I wouldn't have had when I began. We would have never dreamt that we had to have possible law enforcement involved with an election, right? I mean, we just didn't think that, but now we do. And so MTCCA is Maine's Town City Clerks Association, and they work very closely with Shenna and her staff to ensure that we're all checking the boxes and plan A, B, C, and D is thought of ahead of time. And then we're ready and we have the resources to be able to implement those plans so that we can, at the end of the day, allow every single person who shows up to vote, who is qualified to vote.
I'm going to put on my to-do list to bake a pie for my election workers next time I go vote. And I hope everyone who is watching this is doing the same. That's incredible. But Shelly, you touched on something there about disinformation and having to manage that. And there's a lot of different forms of disinformation. One being that there really is an information gap from members of the public on how they understand elections to be funded and what they understand, you know, where they understand the responsibilities to fall there. We just did a round of polling nationally and did some research on where the public is on their understanding of election administration funding and, you know, where that responsibility falls. And only 1 in 5 voters understands that is mostly a local and state responsibility. And so there's a lot of education that we need to do in our communities to help folks understand that there really is a gap in folks getting what they need to you know, adapt to these increasingly challenging environments. And when we're talking about things like cybersecurity or physical security, that costs money, and folks don't realize that those resources aren't out there right now for locals to get those resources. So we're hopeful that, you know, through having these conversations and, you know, folks that are watching this and conversations that you're having to share that we actually haven't had investment from the federal government and elections since the iPhone was invented, and a lot has changed since then. So, you know, I think knowledge is power, but there is, you know, in 2022, we have work to do to help the public understand that, you know, election administration is getting harder, it's getting more expensive, and you responsibilities continuing to fall on the folks that are stepping up at the state and local level again and again.
Can I just touch on that for 1 minute, Will? You mentioned that we haven't seen a major federal investment in our elections since before the iPhone was invented. And that just triggered something for me, because our central voter registration system that we installed in 2007 is the same one that we're using today in 2022. And it is definitely antiquated. It doesn't have all that functionality that could be very helpful for voters. For example, we don't yet have online voter registration, although the legislature just passed it with help from the League of Women Voters. So we're working on that. We don't yet have a voter lookup portal where you can check your registration status and make changes to it potentially online, which would be a huge help. So we're still very rooted in some paper processes. So we did, in Maine, we just went out to bid for a new central voter registration system. But to do that in an environment with uncertainty about federal support for that just constrains that process for sure. And as we think about some of the technological aids, so for example, some states have e-poll books, so they can do voter information lookup from the polling place on election day. And in Maine, unfortunately, we don't have those resources to make that available to the 500 municipalities. Tabulators, here in Maine, we have a consolidated state lease. We use ES&S tabulators. They are never connected to the internet. People should know that. And we send them out to the towns. So the towns then reimburse us for the particular leases that they have. But we do that through a consolidated acquisition. But we don't have tabulators for every single municipality. We don't even have absentee ballot drop boxes yet for every single municipality. We did a significant investment in absentee ballot drop boxes, but the municipalities had to bear some of those costs, and not every municipality chose to do that. So that sustained federal funding, I think that is the message, that unpredictable federal funding can be really challenging to use effectively, but knowing that you're going to have an ongoing stream of revenue will help you make the wisest decisions about technology investments, and to do those investments when they're necessary rather than when you're suddenly desperate to do it, because there's going to be a huge problem if you don't. So I think that's where we need to shift the mindset. We've really been conducting elections on very scarce resources, and that's really, given the importance of our democracy, that's a real problem.
Certainly. And I think that leads very nicely into my next question, which is, and we've already spoken to this a little bit, but about what are some of the tools and resources that election administrators could use to help them with their work, including funding. And I guess, Keara, I'll start with you because I want to hear you talk a little bit more about the election infrastructure.
I missed that last part of that question. Would you mind repeating it?
Sorry, I've got construction that started today. Of course, that's in my building. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the election infrastructure initiative. So just to help get a sense of some of the ways that we can help support election administrators with additional resources.
Absolutely. Thanks for repeating it back to me. So the Election Infrastructure Initiative is a project that was launched about a year ago, focused on, with a goal of securing $20 billion in federal funding for elections over the next 10 years. Originally, we were looking at including that in the infrastructure package itself. But the Election Infrastructure Initiative is vehicle agnostic and policy agnostic. So we want to make sure that locals and states have the resources that they need to be able to have sustainable staffing, ample storage space for equipment, to have computers that can run the latest version of Windows, for example, which really is a challenge for a lot of our local offices across the country. In our research that led us to launch this project, we asked 2020 grantees, if you could double your budget and have it be permanent, what would you invest in? And we had folks come back and say, We would split the election administration role from the mosquito abatement role. We would buy more wood for our wood burning stove that heats our office. And for anyone that works in a small community or in a rural environment, this is not a non-familiar problem. We expect our municipal employees to be doing 100 things at once and be executing it perfectly. And they do. They're incredible. But also, it would be nice if folks could just be expected to be heroes instead of superheroes every single day. And it's important for us to make sure that folks are compensated appropriately and have the support that they need. So where things stand right now, the president came out with a proposed budget about 2 weeks ago that includes $10 billion in federal funding for elections. It includes $5 billion for USPS to offset their role in election administration, and also includes a $250 million innovation grant that locals can apply for. And that's for piloting new technology and innovating in the election space. What happens now is we need to get this budget through Congress. So over the course of the summer, there will be a series of hearings as Congress develops their own budget, and then will be voted on in October or shortly thereafter if Congress isn't able to come to consensus before then. Between now and then, our goal really is to show that there is really broad, widespread bipartisan support for this issue. In our research, we found that over 3/4 of voters support investment in elections generally. And something that was really striking is that 69% of Republicans support federal investment in elections, which is, really promising to see, because we see in the election space right now that, there's a lot of vitriol, there's a lot of public debate, but what our research demonstrates is that it's only this very small part of election administration that is controversial, that 90% of what we're talking about is something that we can all agree on. And in a time where a lot of our issues feel very existential and it feels really challenging to find common ground, this is an area where we have the partnership already, and we have a really clear solution to one of the problems, which is let's get folks resources to alleviate some of this pressure.
That's great. Secretary Bellows or Shelly, do you have any additional thoughts on what's some of the resources that election administrators could use in the state or at the municipal level? I'm curious if you have any additional thoughts there.
I would say right now, the biggest challenge that we're facing is the technology piece. The points that Shenna brought up, making sure that that central voting system is able and ready to work to capacity, because we have some great ideas among the Clerks Association of more efficient manners, which would save time. It would save, budgets, but until that technology is in place and the framework is laid, and all of our 500+ municipalities have access to the same tools, we can't implement those ideas. So we're kind of in this period right now where we can see it and we can almost touch it, but it's not quite tangible yet for us to pick it up and actually see how it works. When I think about some of the redundancies that happen in my office, just for the handling of an absentee ballot, which could actually be cut, the time frame and handling that ballot down because the technology is working the way that it should be working, then that would give me more time to focus on other details that are essential to the integrity of the elections process. But, when you're getting an email that you have electronic absentee ballots to download, and then you print them out, and then you have to go to an antiquated system and look up every single voter. And then you have to manually key in that that voter is able to get that ballot and when your ballots are coming in. And you're going into that system every single step of that ballot's movement. And then, you can print a barcode, which will allow you to process them quickly by batch. But until you get to that point, it's very time consuming. And then, of course, the ballots come back and then they're tracked again. I mean, all of the layers that we have that are put in place are essential. They're essential because it's the only way to guarantee that a person's ballot is being handled appropriately and cast. And they can get, listed on the voter participation. But I have previewed the software. I have seen the polling books that Shenna mentions. I have actually thought about it in terms of my college students and the fact that they could step up to a kiosk and they could have access to inputting data, uploading their essential documents which support their registration, and they can sign the poll book right then and there. So we capture everything. Is just technology that seems like it's Star Trek, but it's here. We just gotta get the financial backing and the support to make it a reality.
Amen. 100% agree. And I think, coming in as a relatively new secretary in 2021, I was astonished. That our central voter registration system was operating on Internet Explorer, which is definitely at end of life. It's about to no longer be supported by Microsoft. Just little basic things like that. And when we talk about, one of the questions in the chat was about cybersecurity. So the good news is, when people think about, outside entities or foreign actors trying to hack into our elections, it would be our tabulators, for example, are never connected to the internet, so they can't be hacked in that way. Our central voter registration system is backed up multiple times a day, and actually backups are sent off-site to a secure storage facility. So we could stand up our central voter registration system file again if it were compromised in any way at any point. We have paper redundancies. We have our systems in some ways are really robust and very resilient. But when you think about vulnerabilities, and you think about aging technology, and you think about using a system that is still using Internet Explorer in 2022, that those are real challenges. And those, I know that Maine is not alone. In talking to my colleagues across the country, this is happening all across the country because the burden of supporting elections has been sort of sent down to the states and sometimes to the municipalities. And in the state, or other states do county-based election administration. New England's a little bit unique in our municipal-based election administration system. But I think that's very, very worrisome. And technology can be such a powerful tool for voter engagement and participation, and also for voter integrity. And I think that's what we would like to see happen here in our state. And that's what we're committed to doing. But we need the resources, the sustainable resources, to move that forward.
That's great. So I'm definitely taking away the resources message from today's conversation, which I think is a great thing to be a takeaway. So I only have a couple more questions, and then I want to make sure we have time to turn to a few questions from the audience. So if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I have one question that came to my mind because of what you were saying, Shelly, about administering the 2020 election during a pandemic. And this is pretty much right up that path. How has and is COVID changing election administration? I know that there's a lot that we did newly for the first time in the state, partially as a result of COVID, but just generally speaking in elections, how has COVID sort of reshaped our thinking around election administration.
So I will jump on this, I guess, to start. So I think that what COVID did for clerks in Maine was it helped us really examine the voting place layout and the logistics of how we move people in and out and through like voter registration and the incoming and then to the point of casting their ballot. So we really, I mean, we've always had a voting place layout where you have to have 6 feet between the voting machine and this guardrail, and we have certain layouts that we have to follow. But when we were trying to manage that, you had to keep 6 feet distance between your voters, and you had to have people be able to queue up or line up or have space large enough to accommodate that, especially in November where the weather can be very problematic on particular election days. We had to start earlier in making sure that those logistics requirements could be accomplished. We also had to be able to inventory our supplies ahead of schedule. We had to be able to issue information out to our general public on what looked different, what was going to change about their elections experience. So what COVID immediately did was, I think it basically started a little fire under some of us that, wow, this isn't an election that we think about 60 days out. We now think about the election a whole year out. And then we're going to have to communicate with Shenna's office more timely. We're going to have to pay attention to the mailings and the emails. And that's not to say that we weren't doing those things. But in Maine, because elections are local, a lot of clerks wear many different hats. We don't just run elections. We might be the tax collector. We might be the motor vehicle agent. We might be handling vital records. We might be running a whole entire office. And elections is just one piece of that whole entire job responsibility. So what COVID did was it really peeled back the layers of the onion so that the selectmen boards and the councils were talking about the elections more at a front of the house, or the front of the agenda, because they were having to deal with examining the municipality's role in a different way. It had to be more proactive. And I'm not sure that that's making sense, but I think what it did is it made us better at organizing and planning ahead and being prepared for whatever came our way. It definitely forced us to communicate also. I saw an influx of a lot of municipal websites going up, or websites that maybe weren't getting a lot of foot traffic or having lots of postings. All of a sudden, they were getting their postings out and they were having more public participation on both sides, from the councils and the selectmen down, and then the public up. We started, doing remote access of public meetings. So anyone cooking supper or sitting in their living rooms could watch the town council and the selectmen's meeting, and they could hear firsthand what was going to happen with that election. They didn't have to rely on the neighbors or what they heard at the country store. So it definitely made us all really think about it more in an organized manner.
Shelly, I think you hit the nail on the head in that change. And we've seen this across the country that, pre-COVID, there was a lot of conversation about needing to be prepared for emergencies, and elections administrators across the country have demonstrated that they have been preparing and can rise to the occasion. And also this was a real tangible example of why security is not, election security is not just about protecting against bad actors. It's also protecting against events that are outside of our control and making sure that our systems can withstand that pressure. And in well, we're still in the pandemic, but in a post start of COVID reality, we know that folks are going to change their voter behavior if there are factors outside of our control, and we need to be prepared for that. And one thing that we've really seen is an increase in folks utilizing absentee voting systems, for example, that leads to a ton more paper moving into offices. And all of that needs to be data entered, and it also needs to be stored. And storage costs money, and data entry costs money. And sometimes these factors are things that we can plan for, maybe it's legislative change, but sometimes the public is just going to adapt to something that's happening in their community, a natural disaster or illness or things of that nature. And so making sure that we have these plans and some wiggle room, that we're not asking our folks to operate in the margins, that, just giving them enough to operate under the status quo and not having any extra space, or, not having one extra person that can jump in if there's something happening. That's a dangerous place to put our public servants. So, when we're talking about election security, and we're talking about making sure that our elections are secure, part of that is giving the folks that are administering elections what they need to prepare, and sometimes even a little bit extra as, a just in case.
Very well said. Well, I'm going to go ahead and ask my last question, because this is the exciting one. That's where you come in. And so how can the community show support for and lift up our election heroes? What can we in the community do to help support our election heroes and help support our elections?
Volunteer at the polls. So the clerks have a great website. I'll put it in the chat, where people can sign up to be an election worker. As I mentioned, Maine law requires election workers from both parties. And if you are a more partisan person, you're involved in political parties very actively, you could be a poll observer. So that's something that we can be really proud of in Maine. Our elections are very transparent, with observers from both parties present during the election itself, and then when tabulation happens. I think that's the number one way to support your clerks. I think super minor, but if you're moving, let your clerk know. Some of the voter registration challenges that we have, in part because of our antiquated system, I think clerks very much love it when people take the time to say, hey, I'm relocating, please remove me from the rolls, or just keeping your voter registration update and current. And then stop disinformation wherever you hear it. When you hear a lie, just say, look, that is not true. But also be careful. If something sounds sensational, if it sounds awful, if it sounds unreal or crazy, it might very well be disinformation. So be very cautious about sharing things that are not from verified sources, or that you haven't fact checked yourself, because we can only be part of the solution if we're all taking proactive measures to really support and strengthen our election heroes. And in this conversation, I see Shelly as an election hero. Although Keara, CTCL, I'm very happy for the advocacy you're doing at the federal level. Seeing President Biden's budget proposal was just, gave me so much joy. And I know it's a long, we haven't seen the finish line yet, but just to even think that it's a possibility. So thank you for the work you're doing as well.
I would agree with everything that Shenna just said. And I would also say that an election happens every day of the year in somebody's office. So it's not just on election day. If you have a special talent, or you have time to give, or you want to just pop by with a smile and say, hey, how you doing today? How's it going? That means so much to the clerks. I have a huge volunteer base, which they have come in and they have filed for me. They've stapled packets. They've done photocopying. I will take anyone who has time in my office to help with any small thing, because the more we can prep ahead, the more time I save when I get into the busyness of the election day. And if you don't have time to give, but you know that you need to get your car registered or you need to get some stuff at the town office, please remember that on election day, that office is probably already stressed to the max. So maybe it's not the best day to go get your car registered. Maybe perhaps you want to plan it on a different day when they're not running around trying to organize an election. But I would just say to anyone, as Shenna did, if you hear something or you watch the 6 o'clock news and you hear something that just doesn't seem like it passes the straight face test, send an email to your clerk or send an email out to your officials in your municipality and just say, hey, could you just elaborate on this a bit, because this caused me a bit of heartburn. Don't talk about it on Saturday or Sunday night with all your friends and then create this situation where everyone's all in angst. Just pick up the phone or email, ask the question, or check their website. Perhaps it's already been addressed on the website.
That's so true. And in addition to bringing pies to your polling place, which is my takeaway from this briefing, and I just love that idea. Another way to help in the quest to secure additional funding is to make sure that, you know, the support is vocalized, that we have a majority of folks that agree that we need to make this investment, that this is something that folks from across the aisle can come together on. But our decision makers don't know that unless they're hearing this positive message, this opportunity for collaboration from their constituents. So we put together a toolkit that shares some of that hopeful message. And, you know, I believe really deeply in the power of gratitude, that so often I think our politics can feel really nasty, or that we need to hold decision makers constantly accountable for things that we haven't even, you know, made clear yet. That is something that we are asking for. And so our goal here is to really make sure that as decision makers are thinking about this budget, that we know that this is something that is hopeful, that will solve problems for folks, and that really centers the heroes like Secretary Bellows and like Shelly and local elections officials in all of our towns that are working to really do their best to help their communities and to let all of us have our voices heard. So thank you, election heroes. Thank you for having us here today. And it's just so great to be able to talk about the nuts and bolts of what's happening in these offices, because more people need to know about it.
Absolutely. And I'm going to go ahead and put one more thing in the chat. There's been so much helpful information shared. I'm going to put the addresses for the clerks in the state because, you know, as I mentioned at the top, today is Thank Election Heroes Day. And so we've been going to election offices today, thanking clerks. And I'm going to add one more thing to your to-do list. If you go and see your local election clerk, let them know how you can help. I think that sounds like it's one of the best ways to show your gratitude and your appreciation. So just let them know that you're willing to get involved and help out. But those addresses are there, so I would strongly encourage everyone to either swing by the office, send a thank you card. I'm going down to Portland in an hour to City Hall to do that myself. So really just let's use today to celebrate our election heroes. And I really just want to thank all of you on this call for joining and helping to center our election heroes in the conversation today. I know I saw in the chat that Shenna was doing an amazing job of getting to the Q&A questions. So I want to thank you for that. So I hope folks are able to get some answers, and certainly reach out to us if you have anything else that you'd like for us to ask. I work with all of you all the time, and you're always so helpful whenever I have questions. So certainly looking to pass that along. All right, well, we can go ahead and leave it there then. I just want to thank you all again so much for all you do and for taking the time to talk today. I enjoyed this conversation so much. So great to see you all. All right. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. This was awesome. Celebrate election workers.
Yes, please.